Hey everyone, welcome to this short legacy video. A couple days ago, I listened to the Brainstorm Show podcast. It was my first time listening to the podcast. It was awesome though. You guys should check it out. But what this episode was sort of focused on was building a Bug Delver deck that was a little bit more suited towards beating Miracles. Uh, Miracles is usually a pretty rough matchup for Delver decks. For a couple reasons, for several reasons actually. First of all, you play a lot of one drops because you want to be efficient, and that sort of makes you pretty weak against the counterbalance Sensei's Divining Top Lock. Another reason is your Wasteland plus Daze resource denial counter plan is not great because they play a lot of basics. Once you get to the mid game against Miracles, it becomes pretty unlikely that you'll be able to daze them off of their stuff and waste them out of their colors. And then also they just have a lot of great ways to answer your stuff. I mean, you basically have two options. You can play one threat at a time to play around Terminus, but that sort of just leads you into Swords to Plowshares, Snapcaster Mage, Swords to Plowshares, and you can't really establish enough pressure fast enough if you do that. A lot of the time, I mean, sometimes it works. The other option, of course, is to try and establish a good board early in the game and put a lot of pressure on, but that can lead you into getting blown out by Terminus, of course. So Delver is not a deck that inherently has a good Miracles matchup at all. Um, I wouldn't say it's like unwinnable matchup or anything, but it's very rough. Especially if you're playing a deck like Rug Delver that can't answer counterbalance once it hits the field. You're sort of in for a bad time. But this deck looks like it has a lot of different ways it can shore up that matchup. First of all, you're playing 4 Abrupt Decay, which of course is the best answer out there to counterbalance. It deals with counterbalance, no nonsense. But you're also playing stuff like Nimble Mongoose, which is not, I mean, it's not like the be all end all threat against Miracles, because of course they still have Terminus to deal with it, but at least it can't be dealt with Swords to Plowshares, and it can't be bounced with Jace. So it's a pretty solid threat against them. Playing this card over Tarmogoyf in Bug Delver is very unique. I have pretty much never seen a card or a Bug Delver deck that completely didn't play any Tarmogoyfs and played Mongoose instead. Of course, before Deathrite Shaman was a thing, most of them used to play 4 Mongoose and 4 Tarmogoyf along with the Delvers. But this deck, you're playing only these 1-drop threats uh, and no 2-drops. And that's one of the things that the guys talked about was if you're playing a card like Abrupt Decay as a 4 of, which is a great card, it's one of the best removal spells in Legacy for sure. It's a nice universal answer to a lot of stuff. Can't be countered, which is of course awesome. But at 2 mana, it's kind of clunky compared to stuff like Lightning Bolt, for example, which Rug Delver gets to play. So in order to sort of deal with that, their goal is to make the rest of the deck as efficient as possible to make up for the fact that you're playing 4 copies of Abrupt Decay, which can be kind of clunky. So that was another reason behind including these 4 Nimble Mongoose instead of the Tarmogoyfs. If you look at more conventional Bug Delver lists, this is what a lot of them look like now. You're playing stuff like Hymn to Torak, which, I mean, Hymn to Torak is one of my favorite cards in Legacy. Let me just get that out there. I love hymning opponents out of their mana. It's one of the better feelings. But Hymn to Torak is not a great card for tempo because you're paying 2 mana to get rid of 2 of your opponent's cards that they didn't pay any mana for. Um, Same thing with Thoughtseize, which I've actually seen some of these decks play in the main deck. Thoughtseize, you're paying 1 mana to deal with something that your opponent didn't pay mana for. So in terms of tempo and resource efficiency, it's actually not the best thing you can be doing in a tempo deck. So this deck is a little bit more tuned to avoid that problem. It's playing Stifle, and Stifle is a much more tempo-oriented card than a card like Hymn to Torok or Thoughtseize. Stifle, of course, is an automatic 4 of in any Rug Delver list, but I don't know. It's sort of been, I'd say, about half the Bug Delver lists I've seen play it. There's the Bug Delver list that Jim Davis has sort of made popular. That's a lot more tempo-oriented of a list versus these Hymn versions, which are really almost bridging the gap between mid-range and tempo decks if you're playing like Liliana of the Veil and stuff like that. So anyway, this deck it's really leaning more towards a Rug Delver Canadian threshold tempo style of play, but also trying to shore up the Miracles matchup by playing Abrupticate. And there's some other stuff I'll go over. But yeah, so that's sort of the reasoning behind playing Nimble Mongoose and Stifle. Then we have, and this is the one change that I've made to the deck from what the guys at the podcast came up with. They had 2 Vendilion Clicks in their list, which I can really get behind that. I think Vendilion Click is an underrated card in Legacy, especially in tempo decks. It used to be pretty popular, but you've really seen it drop off the map. I guess people don't want to pay 3 mana for a threat in a tempo deck, but I think for what the card does, it's definitely justifiable. But I did replace one of the Vendilion Clicks with a True Name Nemesis, just purely because I want to draw both cards and see which one works better. I think if I were to take this deck to a tournament tomorrow, I would play the 2 Vendilion Clicks, but the True Name Nemesis is in there just to test. Because I think it's a good threat in the same way that Nimble Mongoose is a good threat. Like, Terminus or another sweeper is really the only answer that your opponent can have. So I don't know. I just wanted to try it out. I think it's also a pretty underrated card right now. It sort of jumped on Legacy when it was first printed, but then lost some popularity for whatever reason. I don't know. It could very well be true that you don't want this card in the deck, but I figured may as well test it. Okay, we have a couple main deck dismembers. This is mostly to shore up the Eldrazi matchup. Eldrazi, at my first impression, seems like a pretty bad matchup for this deck. Probably more so than a typical Bug Delver list. And the reason for that is, I think when your opponent's playing stuff like Thought-Knot Seer, you're really going to miss having Tarmogoyf in your deck, or other fatties like Gurmag Angler. Getting a Tarmogoyf to a 5/6 is usually a win against Eldrazi, because none of their creatures can attack through that. The only way they can really beat that is with, if they attack and you block, and then they dismember your Tarmogoyf, or they have that 6 mana one that taps your creature, Endbringer. Sorry. But usually like a big Tarmogoyf is very difficult for them to attack. This deck, your biggest creature is a 3/3, so I don't know. It can be. I haven't tested it, of course. I haven't played a single game with this deck yet, but my guess is that the matchup is probably not amazing. But anyway, these 2 main deck dismembers sort of shore that up, because they can kill any of the Eldrazi creatures. So for 1 mana, so it's one of the better cards to have against them. The rest of the deck I'm not going to go over in too much detail. It's your usual Delver stuff: Brainstorm, Ponder, Spell Pierce, Daze Force. You've got your 18 lands. This is the standard breakdown of most Delver decks. You have, of course, a playset of Wastelands, 8 fetches, and then 3 and 3 on the blue dual lands, 1 for each color. So that's that. The sideboard, we've got a couple. This is the exact sideboard that they had on the podcast as well. You have a couple of Winter Orbs. These are quite good against Miracles or lands, stuff like that. Pithing Needle for, there's a million things you can name with Pithing Needle. Sensei's Divining Top being a big one, but you can also name Grizzlebrand against a Grizzlebrand deck, or Sneak Attack, or pretty much anything. Painful Truth comes in against Miracles. Go for the Throat comes in against Eldrazi or Tarmogoyf decks. Other than these Abrupt Decays, we don't really have any other, and the Dismembers, we don't really have any other great answers to a Tarmogoyf once it hits the field, so it's always nice to have extra removal. Thoughtseizes for combo decks, and also Eldrazi. You have Disfigure for other Delver decks, decks with Deathrite Shaman, etc. Death and Taxes, you know. And you've got 3 Surgicals. I was a bit surprised to see 3 Surgicals in their list. I actually bought another Surgical just to test this out, so to you guys at the Brainstorm show, I'm taking your word that you want 3 Surgicals. Yeah, these come in against graveyard-based decks or combo decks like Storm, and then Flusterstorm is just a nice counter to win counter wars with and to beat Storm. So, anyways, that's the deck.